You are listening to the Roberta Glass True Crime Report, putting the true back in true crime. From New York City, Roberta Glass is now on the record.
Hello. In 1988, authorities in Omaha, Nebraska, examined allegations of a child prostitution ring stemming from the Franklin Community Federal Credit Union. The allegations that Larry King was prostituting children to the prominent and powerful. Private investigator Gary Caradori was hired by the state of Nebraska to investigate these claims, but he died in a plane crash with his son in July of 1990. In May of 1994, a documentary about the scandal was set to air on the Discovery Channel, but was pulled at the last minute, only adding to the scandal's lore. It's the holy grail of conspiracy theories, producing 2 books, The Franklin Cover-Up by John DeCamp and The Franklin Scandal by Nick Bryant. A number of podcasts it's inspired, and it's inspired a whole host of researchers, all dedicated to uncovering the truth about the Franklin Scandal. But was the Franklin Scandal a carefully crafted hoax, as the grand jury determined, who sentenced alleged victim Alisha Owen to 9 to 15 years in prison for perjury? That's what they concluded. Today, we are going to examine Alisha Owen's interview and her claims, and you can decide for yourself whether you think it's a hoax or, in fact, a cover-up. So one of the first things that really made me start thinking about the Franklin Scandal, because conspiracy of silence is certainly so incredibly powerful and convincing, right? You're certain after you've watched that you've known the truth, but maybe I've just watched too many of these documentaries that turn out to be not true. But I saw this interview, Nick Bryant, who wrote the Franklin Scandal book, he's a journalist. He had an interview with Alisha Owen, and I found it extremely strange. And I think we can watch it together. But before we do that, let's just take a little look at the Joe Rogan podcast and his summation with Tim Dillon's summation of the Franklin Scandal.
Wrote The Franklin Scandal, which is a book about the original Epstein thing, like the original sex trafficking thing.
What's that?
Well, the Franklin Scandal was a scandal out of the Franklin Credit Union, where there was a guy who was embezzling money, and then he was being investigated for that, but they said he has all this money because he's running an interstate pedophile network, and he's pandering kids to, people in Washington, D.C. and New York. This was a scandal with real victims who wanted to testify, and then people started dying. The private investigator they hired, his plane broke up. One of the girls that testified was found guilty of perjury, and then she was put in solitary confinement. Now, it's not as sexy as like a Pizzagate or something because it happened in the 80s and 90s, but this shows you the blueprint for the government, using marshaling resources to silence people that were victims of this stuff. This is not new. Congressmen, senators, blackmail being used by intelligence agencies, none of it's new.
So that is a short from the Joe Rogan Experience. So the girl that Tim just mentioned in that clip is Alisha Owen, who he said the government marshaled its forces to silence her. So meaning she refused to recant her testimony that Larry King, who worked with this credit union, the Franklin Credit Union, that went down as sort of like a Ponzi scheme type operation, that he trafficked her and that she refused to recant, like the other witnesses, some of the other witnesses did. She and I think it was Owen and Paul Bonacci refused to recant, and they were both charged with perjury. But Owen received a 9 to 15-year sentence, which is quite hefty. So they make it look like, everything, her claims were 100% true and verified, and that the government was like came down on her to punish her. And they also often like to talk about that she did 2 of those, the 4.5 years she did for this, because she was already at the beginning of this scandal, she was already in prison for cashing bad checks. So in September of 1998, September, of 1988, she had been arrested for cashing bad checks. So that's the beginning of her involvement, involvement, as far as I know, with the criminal justice system. So let's look at some of those. So let's look at her interview together. But before we do, let's take a little break, and I'll meet you on the other side of the break. If you are enjoying this episode of my True Crime Report, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this episode. Get access to exclusive podcasts and other bonus content by becoming a patron today. If you have a question or comment for me, shoot me a super chat, and I'll do my best to answer it and read it on air. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. Okay, so let's look at this. Let's look at this Nick Bryant podcast together.
Nick Bryant podcast, episode 1. I'm an unrepentant Luddite, but I'll try to pull this off without a hitch. I should add parenthetically that I'm not the BBC correspondent named Nick Bryant. We often get confused, even though he's much better looking than me. I wrote a book, The Franklin Scandal, a story of power brokers, child abuse, and betrayal, about an interstate child trafficking network that was covered up by state and federal authorities, much like the Jeffrey Epstein network. In the Epstein case, the FBI ignored the victims, but in the Franklin case, the FBI pressured the victims to recant their accounts of abuse. But one girl and one boy refused to recant their accounts of being sexually trafficked as minors. A state grand jury indicted the boy on 3 counts of perjury, and the girl was indicted on 8 counts of perjury.
So the boy is Paul Bonacci, and the girl is Alisha Owen. And that is she on the right-hand side of the screen for those of you who are watching on YouTube or Twitter, or I think I also stream to Facebook.
He was staring at 60 years in prison, and the girl was staring at 120 years in prison. A federal grand jury then indicted the 21-year-old girl on 8 counts of perjury. Between the state and federal grand juries, she was looking at 200 years in prison, and she still refused to recant. A kangaroo court found her guilty on all counts, and she was sentenced between 9 and 15 years in prison. The authorities really attempted to destroy her by placing her in solitary for nearly 2 years. Her name is Alisha Owen, and she's my guest. Hi, Alisha.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
Not too bad. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great.
So I was wondering, could you give us a little background about yourself?
Well, I was born and raised in Omaha, and pretty much have lived here most of my life, pretty much all of it. And when I was actually 14 to 15, in Omaha, they had it was a teen dance night, and just about, thousands of kids would show up, and it was kind of like a big dance party. And that was my first meeting with some guys that they asked me if I wanted to go to a party, and they made it sound like it would be a lot of fun. So I went, and that was when I started on this awful road.
That's when she started on this awful road. That's what she's going to call her predation by the Franklin Credit Union. I just found that very odd. And that's something that came up in her testimony, that she said that she knew Troy Bonner was one of the other alleged victims in this case, who recanted that she met him in 1983, but everyone else in her life who testified said she met him in 1988 in a bar. So, it's a beginning, but the crux of her story and why she's so crucial to this scandal is she claims that heavily prominent people were involved in this ring, like the police chief. And she said not only was she victimized as a teen by the police chief, that she was victimized by him for a year, and that her victimization ended when she had his child. She also said that she was victimized by a judge. And so that is really, she is really the center of all of these Franklin scandal claims. So let's see if she gets more specific.
Well, the party was affiliated with the Franklin Credit Union, which was essentially a front for a nationwide pedophile network, and it was raided by the FBI. After the raid, word comes down for you to get out of town. Despite the reign of terror that compelled you to garner cash via checks and get out of town. Could you discuss that a little bit?
Yeah, by this time I had developed a relationship with a guy named Troy Bonner, and the raid, I remember it was fall, and we were living a fairly, I wouldn't say super lavish, but lifestyle. And the credit union, got raided, and it was all over the news. And Troy showed up and said, hey, we need to, the FBI's in town. They closed down the credit union. We need to get out of town because they're starting to look at things. And he had talked about going somewhere south. And I was, at that time, I kind of thought, if I take off with this guy, I'm probably going to wind up in a garbage bag in the desert. And so I decided to take off on my own, which didn't really go all that well, but I took off on my own and wound up, almost a year later, not quite a year later, coming back to Omaha. And by that time, there were charges out for my arrest, and I turned myself in.
So that is true. So what the court documents say about this is she was arrested in September of 1988 for passing these bad checks, and immediately she checks herself. She tries to kill herself, then checks herself into a mental hospital. In that mental hospital, she meets fellow patient Michael Casey, who's described in the court documents as a con man. He's a former Boys Town employee. And he has this idea to sell books, movies, and basically, like any kind of media, by creating this story connected to the real story of the Franklin scandal, of the Franklin Credit Union Ponzi scheme, where Lawrence E. King, not the Larry King, that the host, but Lawrence E. King, who was a Black Republican, sang at the 1984 Republican National Convention in Dallas. He was actually providing children to the rich and powerful. So in the court documents, they talk about letters between Michael Casey and Alisha Owen, and saying, as soon as you get out of prison for doing these bad checks, you'll have a job as a consultant. You'll have a job, and he had tried to sell other kinds of projects. He had been in LA. This was his other kinds of projects based on, Boys Town, other ideas. And he had come up with this idea that the Franklin scandal was a scandal of child sex trafficking. Whether he was basing that on something real or not, it's hard to know. But I just find Alisha Owens very odd in this. She knows that the subject of the interview is the Franklin credit scandal. Her relationship with Nick Bryant is all, excuse me, I had to cough, is all about the Franklin credit scandal. And she's talking very vaguely about it. And Nick is like, she relies on Nick to add the details. Now, someone who's really, who would be defending Alisha Owen could say, well, maybe she's traumatized from the experience. Maybe she's really shy of going into details because she's been charged with perjury before. That I think would be a fair defense for that. No?
20-year-old, you eventually returned to Nebraska, and then you were given 3 to 4 years in prison for bouncing checks. Why do you think you were given such a ridiculous prison bed?
Well, because of my connections. It was, I came back to town. I wasn't supposed to come back to town. I came back to town, and basically I was going to be buried, locked away, and for lack of a better word, hidden. So I should have, I should have stayed gone, but I didn't. And
see, on its face, it does sound like a long sentence for bad check cashing. How many bad checks did she cash? At what amounts? What are the details of her check cashing case? Hard to know, right? And if I can find if anyone has any information about her check cashing case, send it to me. Was it a really inappropriate sentence? It's hard to know without knowing any of the details of it. But I find it hard to believe that her check cashing bad checks was a punishment for her coming back into town. Then don't cash bad checks if you know that you're going into town where they're hostile to you. No? Is that too simplistic? Let me know. Let me know what you think.
And it was like, okay, if you're not gonna stay gone, then we're gonna help you be gone. So I was sentenced to 3 to 4 years. And the thing about that sentence, and what really sent a message, is the structure of that sentence. That sentence was not, normally in Nebraska, you do half of your time. And the way the sentence was structured, they were done back to back. So I would have to complete one full sentence and then go to the next sentence. So it means you're basically...
That's up to a judge's discretion, whether you're going to serve concurrently or consecutive sentences. But here, Alisha Owen is presenting it like it's specific to her, that this was an extra bit of punishment that they were giving her, is what I mean.
you're not doing everything concurrent, you're doing them consecutive, which really means that you're doing multiple sentences at one after another. They call it boxcarring. And my ultimate sentence from the grand jury, they did the same exact thing. So I think that if you look at it, it definitely gives a message from the judicial branch.
And as we know, the judicial branch is very corrupt, which we'll talk about later. So social services went to federal and state law enforcement because they knew that there was a pedophile network that was active, and they were just completely ignored by federal and state law enforcement. Finally, these social services personnel went to the Nebraska Senate, and they found an audience there, and then the Franklin Committee was formed, and Gary Caradori eventually became its investigator. You had numerous meetings with Gary. What were your impressions of him?
Well, the first time, because the first time I met him while I was in prison. And I was in total shock. I had not expected, I figured I was buried, and he shows up, and he was so kind and unassuming. And we talked a little bit, and I basically just told him, I don't know. I don't know that I want to talk to you. And because he knew certain things that I knew that he had been talking to somebody.
So this is really odd. So we know a little bit about Alisha Owen, right? We know that she is a feisty number, right? She's not going to recant. She's going to tell the truth, right? But yet when she meets Gary Caradori, she doesn't want to talk to him. Same thing with Nick Bryant. She tells the same story with Nick Bryant. She didn't want to talk to him, which is fine if you have one kind of personality, but I find that incongruent with her personality, right? With someone who's not going to recant, who would rather do a prison sentence than recant, but she's scared talking to Gary Caradori, who's set up by the state of Nebraska to investigate these claims. Wouldn't you be dying to talk to him if you have that kind of personality? And so let's just talk about her first claim with the police chief, right? So she claims that her child was the child of this police chief who abused her for a year. And she testified all about, his body, what it looked like naked. But she left out a major thing, which was that he had gotten shot undercover while he was undercover in the 70s. And his left arm had atrophied. He had a huge scar on his left arm that went to his hip and his hip. She knew nothing about that. Also, the police chief also offered his blood DNA, and it was incompatible with the child. So also, Alisha Owen had told her friend exactly, and she had applied for benefits, Medicaid benefits, saying the father of the child was X. So that's a major problem. Another problem is that she had one very specific claim that this police chief had put part of his abuse was to take a gun out of his shoulder holster and put it up inside her, right? So then they had witnesses come in saying his under, right, the under policeman who worked under him for 7 years said this guy never carried a gun and he never had a holster. And he just didn't use a gun. And his secretary testified that he never saw him with a holster, and he didn't carry a gun when he was police chief. So problems, there's problems with her story. So, that's just one of them. That's just one of them. We'll get to the judge a little later. But that was a major problem. And you can see that the police chief has been totally ghosted out of this interview.
And I knew that he was on the right track. And, there were some things I'm not a liar. I wasn't going to deny. But on the other hand, I also hadn't decided whether or not I would talk to him. And I told him, well, I need to talk to my family, because if I talk to you and go forward with this, I need to have the support of my family, because this is dangerous. And he understood that, and he said, okay. I said, I'll see my family this weekend and I'll give you a call and let you know. And my family came up and I told them, and my mom and dad, it was like some pieces of the puzzle clicked for them, and they understood quite a bit of what had been going on, because this is not, I was one of
What was going on, Alisha? That's what I'd like to know. This is the vaguest interview. Am I alone?
the first people I ever knew that went to prison. It's so my parents were, my whole family, my parents, my brothers, my sister, they were like, okay, we'll do this. And so then I talked to Gary. I called Gary and said, okay. And he made arrangements to come up and take my testimony. And I'm sure that people have seen some of the tapes of that on YouTube or whatever, but that's how that started. And through getting to know.
Interesting part of Gary Caradori's comments, he was telling Troy Bonner that he should sue civilly. So he was really aware that these kids, should their claims be substantiated, could sue civilly for quite a lot of money. And for all those in the audience who were yelling about Paul Bonacci's lawsuit against Larry King, where he won $1 million judgment, that was not contested. Larry King never showed up for court. So he won, Paul Bonacci won by default. So what I'm saying is that trial looked like, all the defense witnesses showed up and testified, and that was it. And then the judgment went to Bonacci because Larry King was a no-show.
Gary, he was a very, very special person, and he truly had a heart for justice.
And you made some videos for him where you explicated what the network was like and a number of the people who were in the
videos with a big notebook in front of her, which I find very odd too.
Network. And,
yeah.
And then that enabled him to find some other people who had been in that network, some other victims that had been in that network. And then you were represented by a woman named Pamela Vukotic. And the FBI was doing its best to coerce you and pressure you into recanting your accounts of abuse. And Pamela Vukotic was going to be your savior. She was going to go to bat for you. But she started having an affair with the FBI agent, which is kind of an indication that she's probably not going to go to bat for you. And tell us about your interactions with the FBI while you were in prison.
See, Nick is picking up on something that I think we're all picking up on, which is her lack of rage. If she really had been railroaded, right, and falsely imprisoned for perjury, where's her rage? Where's her anger? You don't see any of that in this interview. And that's what Nick is picking up on. And he's getting angry for her. He's talking about her representative who fell in love with an FBI guy and put her needs before Alicia's, right? Right?
They were horrible. Hindsight is 2020. But at that time, they came in like they were wearing the white hats and we are going to help you and we are going to stop this, because one of the things that was really important to me and that really played in my decision to talk to Gary was actually at that time, I had just turned, I hadn't been an adult for that long. I was 18, 19. And I decided that, it's one thing to be a minor and be in that position, but it's another thing to be an adult and know that something is going on and not doing anything about it. I really felt that that if I didn't talk, I would be complicit, which is just absolutely untenable for me. And that's when I decided that, okay, I have to do this. And the FBI, looking back, were so bad. And then to have my attorney, and she really, really.
So how were they bad? That's just very vague.
Won over my trust. And I was not, anybody that's been through anything like this probably has trust issues. But she won over, and it was heartbreaking. And then to find out, all of the different things that she did,
all of the different things that she did. Okay, can she name one? Let's see.
They did some really, I don't know, in the dirty, they call it dirty pool. Just sneaky, underhanded.
Okay, tell us about it.
Asked me to write out some things and supposedly for another purpose, and then called those things something else and gave them to the FBI. Just total violation of attorney-client privilege. Absolute and complete total violation.
Okay, that's a serious claim. If she's claiming that her defense lawyer's working for the other side, that's troubling. But who knows? Maybe she was distrustful of her story. I don't know.
It was just unreal. It's still hard for me to even process how someone can do that.
And I think it was John Franken, the FBI agent, said to you, if you don't change your story, you're going to be an old woman when you get out of here. Meaning
it was there were basically 2 FBI agents, and then there was Nebraska State Patrol. And the thing that you need to realize is Gary he was a retired State Patrol, and he had full confidence in Nebraska State Patrol. And there was Mickey Mott, who was the one that was close to Pamela Vukotic. And then there was the special agent in charge, Pankinen. And they both said, and at one point, and during this whole time, Pam Vukotic was encouraging me to, to be firm and, stand up for the truth. And when they would say these things to me, they literally said, if you do not recant, and here I am locked in this cell with them, actually a room with them, and if you don't recant, you are going to be an old woman before you ever get out of here. And it's like, no, I can't do that. I mean, that's just wrong.
Were you ever ambivalent about, maybe I should do this, or
no, the one time.
Well, maybe they did that because there was some problems substantiating some of her claims. For example, her claim she said that she was victimized by a judge at a cafe in the basement. And that judge came in and said, gave, I think it was like on, let's say I think it was Saturdays. And he gave his whereabouts, an alibi for where he was on every Saturday in that month that she claimed that she was victimized by him. She also said that there was a party of 35 and that she was victimized in the basement under that party, and that there was a woman who was like the maitre d' at the cafe, or the hostess at the cafe, and she was named, say Sheila. There was no Sheila working there. They had a woman come in who had been working there since the 70s. So there was major problems with her story. And you notice that she's not talking about this police chief, nor is she talking about her baby that came from this supposed police chief. All that now has been just like ghosted out of the story, out of the Franklin scandal. And it's odd also that no other kids have, adults that were kids at that time have come forward and said, oh yeah, Larry King, even with the documentary, Larry King abused me.
I mean, that they were really hammering hard. And this is with all three of them in the room. The State Patrol, Mickey Mott, and Pankinen. I had said, because it was getting close, they were talking about convening a grand jury, and they were telling me that if I went in front of either a federal or a state grand jury, and I didn't recant, and I remember saying, well, then fine, I'll just plead the fifth because I'm not going to recant. And when I said that, I guess that's about as ambivalent as I got.
Yeah, and she tried to appeal on those grounds, saying that I should have been able to take the fifth. Why didn't I take the fifth? And they were like, you could have, no one was stopping you. I think that was the court's response. Don't quote me on that.
All about had coronaries, which should have clued me in. But I thought, no, you know what? Our justice system is set up to be a good justice system in theory. And I still had belief that if you stood up and you did the right thing, that everything would turn out okay, that truth will prevail.
Speaking of truth, let's talk about our friend Bill Gehrig, who visited her in the mental hospital. And according to his testimony, he said, Alisha told me that she was working with Michael Casey, who is an investigative reporter on the Franklin scandal. And that's going to be, her new job. She's going to be his right-hand man. Kind of odd, no?
I still really believe that. And so, no, I guess it was never, recantation was never on the table for me, ever.
Well, then you came up against a couple of grand juries. A lot of people don't know how grand juries operate, but grand juries have been notorious for covering things up. In a grand jury, a special prosecutor is chosen, and then grand jurors are just citizens that have been funneled into jury duty, and then they're put on a grand jury, and the special prosecutor decides what evidence the victim or the grand jurors see, and also decides what witnesses are called. And so they're in an easy place to manipulate grand jurors. And there was I think there was that famous quip by a New York judge that said special prosecutors have so much power over a grand jury that they could get them to indict a ham sandwich. So you're going to go up before this grand jury. You're this kid, you're a 21-year-old kid. You've been in solitary.
Not for nothing, but would you describe a 21-year-old woman as a kid? Let me know.
At this point, they'd put you in solitary, I believe.
Yeah, I'd been in solitary for over a year by that time, I believe. Yeah.
This is another one of these frustrating claims. Like, without her prison records and her behavior, without knowing her behavior in prison, it's impossible to know how much solitary time she did and why she was put there. But the Franklin scandal just asks us to trust our word that she was put there because it was a punishment. It was an extra punishment by the people in power. That's what we're supposed to infer. That not only were they going to put her away for telling the truth, but they were going to keep her in solitary because they're so evil and vindictive, right? But let's see her prison records. What was going on, right? Hard to know.
And the special prosecutor of that grand jury was Samuel Van Pelt, and Pamela Vukotic, who was going to save the children, abandoned you right before your stand before the grand jury.
Maybe she abandoned her because she didn't want to tie her record to a woman with tie her career to a woman with a serious problem substantiating her claims. I mean, it's kind of like a loss, right? A little bit. Like, I don't take any pleasure in doubting. I want to believe Alicia's story, but it's hard, right? It's hard when, it's very, very easy to find out nowadays who's the father, right? That failed. And there's the letters and the cards that were found in her effects from Michael Casey discussing their project. And I know, and I've watched maybe too many innocence fraud campaigns start up for the same reasons, for book money, movie money, deal money, that kind of thing. I'm going to take a quick break and rest my voice, and I'll meet you back on the other side. If you are enjoying this episode of my True Crime Report, please hit the thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and share this episode. Get access to exclusive podcasts and other bonus content by becoming a patron today. If you have a question or comment for me, shoot me a super chat and I'll do my best to answer it and read it on air. Thanks so much. Now back to the show. All right. Hey, Manny. Thank you for the $1.99 super chat. So why did she lie? 9 years is a long time. So my understanding, she did 4.5 years. She was sentenced to 9 years just for the perjury charges. And that is a long time. And my sense is that she wanted to be part of something exciting and money making. Whether the other claims are true, I don't know. But certainly there are problems. Like, Paul Bonacci was in prison also for child abuse, this kind of child abuse. When when he got involved in this story, Troy Bonner was a troubled kid. And of course, the other side of that is that these are who these kind of people target, right? Kids from broken homes, but Alisha was not from a broken home. She was from a strong Christian household, it's my understanding. So she's the sort of outlier among these victims. But yeah, it's very confusing when you have stories changing and retractions. But it's interesting, Troy Bonner's retractions, every time he has to testify under oath where there is consequences to lying, he tells the story that the carefully crafted hoax story. Now, of course, people could say that he tells that story because he wants to stay out of the crosshairs of the powers that be. And so it's kind of one of those things that keeps you from asking skeptical questions, right? Well, of course they're going to lie because, any sort of problem can be like, well, they were just afraid. That's why they lied. That's why there's an inconsistency. That's why there's so many retractions in this. And maybe so. Hard to know. But I have issues with Alisha Owen. Just this interview alone, I find very odd and weird. And her story has massive problems. I'm going to do maybe a little bit more and probably come back to this a little bit later in another episode. But if you guys have questions, let me know. But yeah, it is kind of a shocking thing, right? This is one of these really kind of beloved stories, right? Beloved. I don't even want to call it. I don't even know what to call it. It's so much more than like a scandal. I mean, every part of it has kind of like an exclamation mark. So like the Omaha, Nebraska hires Gary Caradori to investigate, but his plane blows up. And I remember hearing people in interviews who claim to be close to the story saying the FBI came in and they took all the papers from the plane and no one's ever seen them again, including photographs. And that's the other thing. Rusty Nelson, who testified for Paul Bonacci, says he has all these photographs. No one's seen any of these photographs, right? So it's kind of easy. It makes it a little harder to verify. And these are kind of stories can be hard to verify. But even the Maxwell trial, there certainly was a lot of different witnesses, a lot of evidence. And even Maxwell, with her multi-million-dollar defense, did not get over on the jury. It was close, though.
Yeah, it was days.
And could you tell us a little about that grand jury? The grand jury plays an integral role in my book, and I show how corrupt it is. But as a 21-year-old, being hammered by them would be really, really tough.
It was really, really tough. And part of the thing was they were driving me back and forth between Omaha and York, which is about a 2.5-hour drive.
This is incredible. So here's Nick. He's asking for a particular sense memory or a memory with details. What was it like to be hammered on the stand? And she's like, yeah, it was really tough. Again, really vague answer. But let me tell you about the drive to court. The drive was so long to court in the morning. That was really the abusive part. So she wants to get off the sort of specifics of her testimony and right to the travel time. That was really what was punishing, not getting up in court and telling the truth and being challenged and being called a liar. How awful would have that been, for a victim to be called a liar and really harangued on the stand. But she doesn't want to talk about that. She wants to talk about the travel time to court. That's what was really abusive.
So if you are, I mean, you got to be up at the crack of dawn to get there on time, and then you're driving back. It was just, it was awful. It was completely and totally adversarial, and you are not allowed to have your attorney in the room. You are on your own. They sit you up on the witness stand, and it is completely whatever the prosecutor wants to do. If he wants to be mean and nasty, there's no judge that holds them in check. You are.
So doesn't that make it sound like there wasn't a judge? There was a judge that presided over this. I'm not sure exactly if I'm not misunderstanding. If she did some kind of deposition out of the sight of a judge that was used in court, not certain. And in that case, in those kind of depositions, everybody is not allowed to be near their lawyer in those kind of depositions. So I'm not certain what she's describing, but Judge Case was her case. It's unforgettable on this perjury trial. Was her judge. Okay, I think we're almost winding down for the day, but
you are in the arena and alone and don't even have a stick to defend yourself. And what was really...
So remember that she didn't have a stick to defend herself.
Sad to me is because it's just the prosecutor and this grand jury, these people, and there's no oversight. You're just hoping that the prosecutor is a decent human being. There were people doing crossword puzzles. They've been in this grand jury for so many days that they just kind of sit there. I mean, if it, back in those days, nobody had a cell phone or could like be on their cell phone. But I think in this grand jury, if they would have had.
Yeah, you have to check your cell phone, Alisha. At least in court here in New York. I know it differs from state to state, but yeah, I don't think that would have made it much better.
The prosecutor probably would have allowed it. And they only hear what the prosecutor has to say, and they won't even allow you to try and get any evidence in. I mean, you are completely locked, and if you don't toe whatever narrative that they're trying to feed, they'll hold you in contempt, and they'll tell you, we'll hold you in contempt. And throwing me into jail at that point was not I was already in jail. I was already in solitary. What else were they going to do? Take away my birthday? But so I wasn't necessarily, didn't have that hanging over my head, but it was we're going to extend your sentence. You're never going to know when you're going to get out. You're going to be there till you're an old woman. And I still couldn't, you're on the stand and you're fighting for like 3 days for 8 hours a day.
So didn't she just say that she couldn't get her evidence in, and now she's saying that she was on the stand for 3 days, 8 hours a day? So which is it? Did they only want to listen to or did they only? She's saying the jury only wanted to listen to the prosecutor's side, but she was on the stand for 3 days. So what were they doing during that? They were playing crossword puzzles? Is that what she's saying? They weren't listening to her in the 3 days, 8 hours a day that she was testifying? I just find that hard to believe.
It was pretty brutal. It was pretty rough. And I know that they weren't listening. They totally and completely dismissed anything I had to say. So I was pretty sure by the time I had finished testifying that it was going to be a complete and total sham.
Samuel Van Pelt was the special prosecutor.
Also, you know, her friends testified that she told them who the father was. It showed, you know, a friend of her boyfriend's who she was getting revenge on at the time by sleeping with her boyfriend's friend. She was showing his high school yearbook picture to her friends. She was using that name to apply for Medicaid, as I said before. So yeah, there was a lot of counter witnesses. Had she had her own good witnesses, had she been able to substantiate her claims, she would have done better. So that's the beginning of what I have on Alisha Owen. And you can tell where I'm coming from, obviously, but linked in the description of this episode is her court, the court documents, her appeal decision, and that'll give you a little idea of some of the other details of the inconsistencies, her claims that were just basically blown the F out, BFO'd on the stand, as the young people would say. It really was not I would think she would have been a very tough person to defend. But remember, when we meet again next time, that she didn't have a stick to fight with, because that's where we will resume next time. But I'm going to continue to explore this interview and other things surrounding the Franklin scandal. More live streams. Thanks so much. Have a great weekend, everybody. I'll see you back here again soon.